Imagine you find an investment. The technology is real. You have seen it work with your own eyes. Engineers with 30 years of experience have signed their names to it. Members of Parliament have approved it. Your neighbor has already made a fortune from it. Your clergyman has bought in. Your doctor has bought in. The most respected man in British finance has staked his reputation on it. Every number in the prospectus looks extraordinary. Every projection points upward. The company name is printed in bold serif type. The dividend promise is right there in black ink on official paper. You sign. You lose everything. Not because the technology failed. Not because the engineers were wrong. Not because the railways weren't real. But because the men who sold them to you were running the oldest game in human history, and they ran it so well, so boldly, so publicly, that an entire nation watched them do it and called it progress. This is the story of the Railway Mania of 1840s Britain, the most dangerous bubble in history. Because it was built on something true. Before we go any further, let me take you back, not to year 1845, not to the railway embankments of Yorkshire or the counting houses of the City of London. Further, 120 years further, Amsterdam. In year 1637, a single tulip bulb selling for the price of a house on the finest canal in the city. A nation of merchants, the most rational, commercially sophisticated people on earth, bidding against each other in auction rooms for flowers they had never seen bloom. And when it ended in a single week. The prices collapsed, like a held breath, finally released. Fortunes gone, families broken, and the universal human question hanging over the wreckage. How did we let this happen? London. In the year 1720, the South Sea Company, shares in a trading monopoly that barely traded anything, rising from £100 to £1,000 in 8 months. Members of Parliament buying in with both hands, while voting for the very legislation that drove the price higher. Isaac Newton, the man who understood gravity, losing £20,000 and saying words that still echo, "I can calculate the motions of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people." Same island, different century, same ending. And now, London again, in year 1840s. Britain is the most powerful nation on earth. Its empire spans every continent. Its factories are the engine of the world. Its navy rules every ocean. And running through the veins of this empire, literally running, on iron rails, on beds of crushed stone and sleeper wood, with clouds of white steam trailing behind, is the most transformative technology the world has ever seen. The railway. Not a promise, not a theory, not a tulip that might bloom. A machine, a working machine. A machine that had already shrunk a country, that had already moved men and coal and cattle and letters and lives at speeds no horse could match, across distances no road could manage, in comfort no carriage could offer. The railway was real. And that is exactly what made everything that came next so catastrophic. Because when the greed came, and it always comes this time, it had something to hide behind. It had truth. It wrapped itself in steam and iron and parliamentary acts and the signatures of genuine engineers. It stood in front of ordinary people, widows, clergymen, doctors, shopkeepers, servants, and it said, "This is not speculation. This is the future, and you can own a piece of it." And they believed it. Because it was true. But truth and mania, it turns out, can occupy exactly the same moment in history. And when they do, it is always the truth that gets blamed for the damage the mania caused. This is the story of how Britain, at the height of its power, at the peak of its industrial revolution, with the most advanced financial system in the world and the most experienced legislature on earth, did it all again. This is the story of George Hudson, the Railway King, a draper's apprentice from Yorkshire who built a railway empire so vast that Parliament dined at his table and princes shook his hand, and who held it all together, in the end, with nothing but fraud. This is the story of Robert Stephenson, the engineer who built the lines that actually worked and watched, with mounting horror, as men who had never laid a sleeper in their lives sold paper promises on lines that existed only in a printer's imagination. This is the story of Eleanor Marsh, a widow with savings and trust and a leather document satchel, who read the prospectus, believed the numbers, and paid the price that thousands like her paid in the winter of the year 1847. And this is the story that Charles Dickens watched from the street and captured in ink because he understood, before almost anyone else, that what he was watching was not progress. It was a novel, and it had a very dark ending. 140 years after the South Sea Bubble, a new empire at the height of its power, a new technology promising to transform the world, a new wave of ordinary people pouring their savings into certificates they didn't fully understand. Same greed, different rails, same ending. That is how we left you last time, and we meant every word of it. Because the thing about the pattern, the thing that makes it so relentless, so difficult to see from inside it, is that it never looks the same twice. The tulip was beautiful and perishable. The South Sea share was paper and ambition, but the railway was iron. Heavy, functional, permanent iron. It crossed valleys on viaducts of cut stone. It bored through hillsides. It connected cities that had never been connected before. When people in the year 1845 said this is different, they were not simply repeating the fool's mantra. They were right. The railway was different. That was the problem. To understand the mania, you must first understand the miracle. Britain in year 1830 moves at the speed of a horse. Always has. The Roman roads, still the best in England, carry coaches that take 2 days to travel from London to Manchester. Coal that powers the factories of the north travels by canal, slowly, at the mercy of weather and water levels. News moves at the speed of a rider. Goods move at the speed of oxen. Then, on the 15th of September, 1830, everything changes. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway opens. For the first time in history, a steam locomotive carries paying passengers between two cities at speeds that leave onlookers speechless. 30 miles per hour, then 35. The crowd watching from the embankments cannot process what they are seeing. Horses bolt, women faint. A member of Parliament named William Huskisson steps onto the track at the wrong moment and becomes, grimly, the railway's first fatality. Even that does not stop what has begun, because the locomotive keeps moving. The journey that once took 2 days takes 2 hours. The world has been made smaller, and everyone who witnesses it understands, with absolute clarity, that it will be made smaller still. The man responsible for that locomotive is George Stephenson, former colliery engineer, largely self-educated, the father of the railway age. But it is his son, Robert Stephenson, who will build the network that follows. Robert Stephenson is 42 years old in 1845, lean, precise, a man who measures twice and cuts once. He has built bridges that span rivers that no bridge had crossed before. He has laid track across terrain that other engineers considered impassable. He has a gift that cannot be manufactured, the ability to see a landscape and know what it will take to cross it. He is not a financier. He is not a speculator. He is an engineer. And engineers, in a mania, are dangerous because they know things that the market does not want to hear. They know which routes are geographically sound and which are fantasy. They know what a line actually costs to build and what a promoter will pretend it costs to attract investors. They know the difference between a company that will lay track and one that will simply lay prospectuses. Robert Stephenson knows all of this. It will not be enough. The fever strikes once before the Great Mania. In the year 1836, a smaller bubble arrives. Parliament passes dozens of railway acts. Companies form, shares are issued, prices rise. Then the money tightens. Credit becomes expensive. The market corrects. Several companies collapse. Investors lose money. Parliament shrugs and moves on. But something has happened that cannot be undone. The idea has been planted, not in the minds of the engineers or the financiers or the legislators. They already knew what railways could do. The idea has been planted in the minds of ordinary people. The clerk who bought 50 shares in year 1836 and sold them 6 months later for double the price. The draper who mentioned it to his brother-in-law. The doctor who read the prospectus over breakfast and found himself nodding. The first wave proves a simple and lethal proposition. Ordinary people can get rich from railways. By 1844, that idea is everywhere. And a man named George Hudson is ready to use it. George Hudson is not a man you were taught about in school. He should be. He was born in 1,800 inches, a village in Yorkshire, the son of a farmer. He was apprenticed to a draper in York at 15. He was ordinary in every visible way until, at the age of 27, he inherited a sum of money from a distant relative that should, by rights, have simply made him comfortable. Instead, it made him dangerous. Hudson invested in the York and North Midland Railway. He befriended George Stephenson himself. He used his capital and his ferocious social energy to maneuver himself onto railway boards, then to control them. Then through a series of mergers and parliamentary lobbying of breathtaking audacity to dominate the entire Northern Railway network. By 1845, George Hudson controls a third of all railway track in Britain. He is a member of Parliament for Sunderland. He entertains lords and ministers at his house in Knightsbridge and his country estate in Yorkshire. He is called, openly, without irony, the Railway King. And his dividends are extraordinary. Quarter after quarter, year after year, Hudson's railway companies pay returns that no competitor can match. Investors flock to him. They trust him absolutely. They tell their wives, their brothers, their clergymen, if you're putting money in railways, put it in Hudson's Railways. Nobody, not a single shareholder, not a single journalist, not a single parliamentary inspector, stops to ask the one question that would unravel everything. Where exactly is the money coming from? We will return to that question. In the meantime, the prospectuses are flooding the market, and the mania is about to begin in earnest. In year 1844, Parliament passes the Railway Regulation Act. It is intended to bring order, to create a framework, to ensure that railway companies are properly supervised and that the public interest is protected. Instead, it triggers the flood. Because buried within the Act is a requirement. If a company wishes to build a railway, it must apply to Parliament before the end of each parliamentary session. Miss the deadline and wait a full year. The effect is immediate and catastrophic. Promoters, men with maps, printing presses, and very little else rush to file applications before each deadline. Prospectuses are printed by the thousand. Lines are proposed across every county in England. Routes are drawn on maps by men who have never walked the terrain. Engineers' names are listed as consultants without the engineer's knowledge or consent. Projected returns are calculated on assumptions that exist only in the imagination of whoever is holding the pen. In 1845 alone, Parliament receives applications for over 600 new railway companies. 600. Each one with a prospectus. Each prospectus with a promise. Each promise aimed at the savings of ordinary people who believe, with all the reasonable faith of their age, that the future is made of iron and steam, and that they deserve a share of it. Eleanor Marsh is 34 years old and recently widowed. Her husband, a solicitor in the City of London, died of fever in the autumn of 1844, leaving her with a house, a modest income from his practice, and a sum of savings that represents, with careful management, a decent life. Not wealth, not comfort without thought, but security. In the spring of 1845, her neighbor Mrs. Farrow comes to tea and brings something with her, a document. 12 pages, printed on heavy cream stock, bearing the crest of the Midland and Eastern Junction Railway Company. Projected dividends of 11% per annum. George Hudson named as a director. Robert Stevenson listed as consulting engineer. Mrs. Farrow has already signed. Her brother has already signed. The shares have already risen 8% since they were first issued. Eleanor reads the prospectus twice. She is not a fool. She looks for the things a prudent person looks for: the route, the capital requirement, the names attached to it. Everything appears to be in order. The names are real names. The route is a real route. The numbers are extraordinary, but they are not impossible. Other lines have delivered similar returns. She hesitates for 3 days. Then she signs the application form. She pays the deposit, and she folds the prospectus into her leather document satchel, where it will sit alongside increasingly distressing letters for the next 2 years. By the autumn of 1844, the word is everywhere. In the coffee houses of the city, men stand on chairs to read out share prices to rooms packed so tight that the windows drip with condensation. In the drawing rooms of Mayfair, the conversation turns at every dinner, always, eventually, to railways. Which line? Which company? Which route? What price did you pay? What price are they now? In the streets, boys sell printed share lists like they sell newspapers. Charles Dickens walks through London in the late autumn of 1844 and writes in his notebook 3 words: railways, railways, railways. He is not celebratory. He is not afraid yet. He is simply recording what he sees. A city that has lost its mind to a single subject. A perfectly rational city, the financial capital of the world, consumed, completely and without embarrassment, by a mania. The narrator notes for the record that no one at this moment calls it a mania. They call it the future. And they are right, and they are ruined. And both of those things happen at exactly the same time. In the summer of 1845, George Hudson stands at the summit of his power. He hosts dinner parties in his Knightsbridge mansion that members of the cabinet attend. He is consulted by ministers on railway policy that he himself is the primary subject of. He walks into the House of Commons, and men who have governed nations defer to him. He is 50 years old, heavy-set, ruddy-faced, with thick dark sideburns and the permanent expression of a man who has calculated the room and already won. He wears expensive black frock coats. He carries a gold watch chain. He has the hands of a man who once folded fabric behind a counter in York, and the manner of a man who has entirely forgotten that everyone in Britain's financial world knows his name. Most of them have his money. And the narrator who knows what happens next watches him at this dinner, at this summit, in this moment of absolute confidence, and notes the thing that always precedes a fall: the absence of doubt. The men who should stop this are inside it. Parliament in year 1845 passes over 600 railway acts, 600 separate pieces of legislation, each one authorizing a new company to build a new line, each one requiring scrutiny by a select committee. These committees are overwhelmed. The volume of applications is without precedent. The sessions run for months. Members fall asleep in committee rooms. Reports are waved through unread, and the critical detail, a significant number of members of Parliament have personally invested in the companies whose applications they are reviewing. This is not illegal in 1845. This is simply how things work. The ghost of the South Sea Company directors, those gentlemen of early 1720 who passed legislation from which they personally profited, drifts through the committee rooms of the Palace of Westminster. Nobody sees him. Nobody looks. The dividends are too good to invite that kind of scrutiny. Once again, the people charged with protecting ordinary investors are too busy being investors to do their jobs. Here is something the prospectus does not explain clearly. When an investor signs an application for railway shares, they do not pay the full price immediately. They pay a deposit, typically 10%. The rest is paid in installments over the months and years that follow, as the company calls for the capital it needs to actually build the line. This seems, on the surface, manageable. 10% up front, the rest later. But consider what this means. An investor who buys shares in 10 different railway companies, which many do, because diversification seems prudent, has committed not to 10% of their fortune, but to the full value of all 10 positions, payable on demand, in installments, as and when the companies call for them. Eleanor Marsh has paid her deposit. She believes she has committed that sum, and no more. She has committed everything she owns. She does not understand this yet. She will. Robert Stevenson submits a report to a parliamentary select committee in early 1845. It is measured, it is technical, it is devastating. He has reviewed the proposed routes of dozens of companies currently before Parliament. He has identified routes that cross each other at impractical angles, requiring one company to tunnel under or bridge over another at costs neither has accounted for. He has identified proposed lines through terrain so geologically difficult that the capital requirements are double, sometimes triple, what the prospectuses claim. He has identified companies that have listed his name as consulting engineer without ever contacting him. He submits the report. He answers questions from the committee. He is thanked for his contribution. The applications are approved. Stevenson walks out of Westminster into a grey London afternoon, turns up his collar against the cold, and the narrator suspects, says nothing. Because he is an engineer, he has made the calculation. He has submitted the figures. What men choose to do with accurate information is, in the end, not his domain. His domain is the track. And the track, unlike the market, always tells the truth. Charles Dickens is 33 years old in 1845, and at the height of his powers, which means he is simply the most perceptive observer alive in Britain. He is writing Dombey and Son, a novel in which the railway is not a symbol of progress, but a force of destruction. It tears through a London neighborhood in his pages, with the indifference of pure capital, leveling houses, displacing families, remaking the city in its own image without asking permission of anyone who lives there. But Dickens is not a Luddite. He understands what the railway is. He has ridden them. He admires the engineering. He sees the genuine transformation. What he cannot abide, what he records in his notebooks, with the precision of a surgeon making an incision, is the human cost hidden inside the financial spectacle. The railway navvies living in flooded ditches at construction sites, while shareholders in top hats survey the same sites from embankments above. The prospectuses, written in language deliberately designed to obscure rather than illuminate. The men in mahogany offices who know exactly what the numbers mean and who are counting on the fact that the men signing the application forms do not. Dickens watches. Dickens writes. He is the conscience of an age that doesn't particularly want one. October 1845. This is the top of the mountain. Railway share prices have risen continuously for 18 months. New prospectuses are still being issued daily. The Railway Times and the Railway Chronicle, two publications that have come into existence specifically to serve the mania, publish lists of new companies every morning. The lists are longer than they were the week before. The lists are longer than they were the month before. Investors who bought in 12 months ago have doubled their money. Investors who bought in 6 months ago have made 30%. Investors who bought last month have made 12% already. The momentum is self-sustaining. Rising prices create confidence. Confidence creates buyers. Buyers create rising prices. The economist later calls this a reflexive loop. In 1845, it is simply called doing very well, thank you. And at the top of this mountain, at this exact moment of maximum confidence, the narrator pauses. Because this is the moment that always matters, not the crash, not the inquiry, not the parliamentary committee convened in the aftermath. This moment. October 1845, the peak. When every investor in Britain looks at their portfolio and sees nothing but upward lines, and not a single one of them believes they are standing on the edge of a cliff. The railway companies currently approved, under construction or pending approval, will, if all are built, require capital investment greater than Britain's entire national debt. Nobody says this out loud. Not at dinner parties, not in committee rooms, not in prospectuses. It is, at this moment, in October 1845, the most important number in Britain. And it is invisible. Now we ask the question, where is the money coming from? George Hudson's railway companies have paid extraordinary dividends quarter after quarter, year after year, returns that no competitor can match, and that no inspector has ever been able to fully explain. The shareholders are happy. The press is admiring. Parliament is impressed. The answer, when it finally comes, and it will come, is simple and criminal. Hudson has been paying dividends from capital, not profits, not returns from operating railways. Capital, the money invested by shareholders themselves, paid back to those shareholders as if it were income. The accounts have been falsified. The reports submitted to shareholders have been fabricated. Contracts for land, materials, and services have been awarded to companies that Hudson secretly owns at prices that transfer money from the railway companies into his personal fortune. Railway shares have been purchased using company funds not to invest in other lines, but to prop up the price of Hudson's own stock. The entire edifice is fraud. Not incompetence, not optimism run too far, not genuine miscalculation. Fraud. Deliberate, calculated, sustained fraud. Conducted in broad daylight for years. By a man who dined with the cabinet. There is a type of man who exists in every financial mania. He is not the fraudster. He is not the innocent investor. He sits somewhere between the two, close enough to the machinery to understand how it runs, far enough from the fraud to deny complicity when it collapses. Captain Mark Huish is that man in 1845. He is an executive of one of the major railway companies, sharp, military in bearing, a man who reads balance sheets the way an officer reads terrain. And in the summer of 1845, reading his terrain with the careful attention it deserves, he sees something he doesn't like. The capital calls from the railway companies under construction are beginning to strain the broader financial system. Credit is becoming marginally more expensive. One or two smaller companies have failed quietly, without much notice. A parliamentary report has noted, in dry and technical language, certain irregularities in the accounts of 3 railway companies whose names are not yet associated with Hudson. Huish does not sell everything, That would attract attention, questions, accusations of insider dealing. Not a legal concept yet, but a reputational one. He reduces his most exposed positions, quietly, efficiently. He takes his profit while there is still profit to take. And then he watches with the controlled interest of a man who is now, essentially, a spectator as the mountain begins, imperceptibly, to crumble. Late 1845. Eleanor Marsh receives a letter. It is from the Midland and Eastern Junction Railway Company. It is addressed to her as a shareholder. It informs her that the directors have resolved to call for the first installment payment on her shares, the installment that was always described in the prospectus, in small print, as payable when the directors deemed it appropriate. The sum requested is nearly twice what she paid as a deposit. She reads the letter twice. She checks the prospectus. The installment is there in print, precisely as described. She had read this paragraph. She had noted it. She had, at the time, concluded that the sum would be manageable. It is not manageable. Not because she is poor, not because she has been reckless, but because she also holds shares in 2 other railway companies, both of which, within the same fortnight, send her the same letter. She sells her dining room furniture. She takes a loan from her brother-in-law at 4% interest. She pays the calls. She tells herself that this is temporary, that the lines will be built, that the dividends will come, that the prospectus promised 11%, and there is no reason the prospectus should be wrong. The narrator says nothing. There is nothing to say that the next 12 months will not say far more clearly. In January 1846, 2 large proposed railway lines are rejected by Parliament after a bitter and expensive legal battle between competing companies seeking rights to the same route. The shares in both companies collapse overnight. Not by a small percentage, not by the kind of modest correction that a confident investor absorbs and forgets, by 40% in a single day. Then more. By the end of the week, the shares are worth a fraction of what investors paid for them. Several smaller investors who had borrowed against those shares to meet calls on other positions find themselves immediately insolvent. The financial press notes this: 2 bad companies, a parliamentary decision, unfortunate for those involved, not a systemic concern. The broader market holds. The major companies are unaffected. Hudson issues a statement expressing confidence in the fundamental soundness of the railway sector. Most investors read this statement. Most investors are reassured. The narrator is not reassured, because the narrator has seen this moment before, in Amsterdam, in London, in every market, in every century where the first crack appears and is explained away as an exception. It is never an exception. It is always the beginning.
The summer of 1846 arrives differently from the summer of 1845. It is difficult, at first, to name the difference. The sun is the same. The streets are the same. The prospectuses are still being printed. The share lists are still being published. The railway navvies are still swinging their picks on the embankments of half-built lines across England. But something in the financial system has shifted. The Bank of England raises interest rates, quietly, marginally, the kind of adjustment that, in ordinary times, would barely be noticed. But these are not ordinary times. These are times of extreme leverage, a financial system in which an enormous proportion of the available capital has been committed in deposits and installment agreements to railway companies across the country. When the cost of credit rises even slightly, the calculation changes. Money that was heading toward railway shares begins heading toward government bonds instead, a better return for a lower risk. Prices stop rising. Then they fall. Slowly at first, then less slowly, and as prices fall, The investors who borrowed money to meet their installment calls find that the shares they hold as collateral are worth less than the debt they have secured against them. Banks call in loans. Investors sell shares to meet the calls. Selling creates lower prices. Lower prices create more calls. More calls create more selling. The mechanism that drove prices up is now, with clockwork precision, driving them down. And the fundamental question, the question Stephenson asked in his report to Parliament 18 months ago, resurfaces in every counting house, every city coffee house, every dining room where railway prospectuses were once waved across the table with pride. Will these lines ever actually make money? For hundreds of proposed companies, the answer is now obvious. No. Parliament, having approved 600 railway companies in 2 years without adequate scrutiny, now faces the consequences of that approval. The companies are returning to Westminster in their dozens, applying for route extensions, seeking permission to merge with competitors, requesting amendments to the acts that authorized them. Because the lines as originally proposed, as originally approved, as originally described in the prospectuses that attracted the investors' money, are financially unworkable. The select committees that once waved applications through in marathon sessions now sit in rooms thick with the peculiar misery of men who are beginning to understand what they have done, or more precisely, what they have failed to do. There is a special quality to institutional embarrassment. It does not announce itself. It sits in the corners of committee rooms. It manifests in the careful language of reports that describe failures in regulatory oversight without using the word failure or the word regulatory. It lives in the gap between what was said on the floor of the House in 1845 and what is being said on the floor of the House in 1847. The Railway King is still, at this point, at his table, still entertaining, still issuing reassurances. But the auditors are coming. And the auditors do not dine at his table. It begins with a single determined shareholder. His name is not famous. He is not a crusading journalist, or a parliamentary reformer, or a financial genius who saw through the numbers. He is simply a man who has lost money in one of George Hudson's companies, and who wants in the stubborn, unremarkable, quietly heroic way that ordinary people sometimes want things to understand why. He demands a proper independent audit of the York and North Midland Railway accounts. The board resists. Hudson's allies on the board are adamant. The accounts are in order. The company is sound. The request is motivated by malice. But the shareholder is persistent. He has allies of his own other investors who have begun to notice discrepancies, numbers that don't align from one quarterly report to the next. Dividend payments that seem, upon closer examination, suspiciously disconnected from the company's reported operating revenue. The audit goes forward in the spring of 1847. What the auditors find destroys a man who once shook hands with princes. Dividends paid from capital, not profits. Contracts awarded at inflated prices to companies secretly controlled by Hudson himself, with the difference transferred to his personal accounts. Railway shares bought with company funds to maintain the appearance of a rising market. Parliamentary testimony that was, in the most literal sense of the word, fabricated. The first report is published in April 1847. George Hudson's shares fall 60% in 48 hours. He does not comment publicly. His solicitors comment on his behalf. The solicitors' comments do not prevent the further collapse that follows. Now the numbers become human. The financial crisis of 1847 is not solely caused by the Railway Mania. A broader agricultural and credit crisis contributes, but the mania is the accelerant on a fire that was already burning. When the railway shares collapse, and the money calls accelerate, and the banks begin to call in their loans, the impact falls with crushing and indiscriminate weight across every class in British society. The wealthy lose fortunes. Country estates go to auction. but the wealthy, at least, have something to lose. The damage to the middle classes is the damage that Dickens will spend the rest of his career documenting. The doctor who invested his practice's working capital and now cannot pay his staff. The clergyman who mortgaged his living to meet installment calls and now faces destitution. The lawyer whose clients had trusted him with their savings and whose professional reputation is now as worthless as the shares he recommended. Eleanor Marsh is ruined. Not spectacularly, not in a single moment, in the slow, grinding, dignity-destroying way that financial ruin works on people who have no safety net. The installment calls have consumed her savings. The loan from her brother-in-law cannot be repaid. The house is let. She moves to smaller rooms, then smaller still. She is not extraordinary. She is not a cautionary tale invented for a documentary. She is in her specific details, if not her exact name, every widow, every spinster, every careful middle-class saver who read a prospectus in 1845 and made a reasonable decision with available information. The information was wrong. The decision was reasonable. The outcome was ruin. Across Britain, the total estimated loss, the wealth destroyed by the Railway Mania, is approximately £200 million. In the money of today, that is a number with so many zeros, it ceases to feel like a number. It feels like a catastrophe. Because it is. Here is the thing about engineers. They do not stop when the money stops. Not the real ones. Not the ones who were building lines because the lines needed to be built. Not because the prospectuses promised 11%. Robert Stephenson, in the winter of 1847 and 1848, is still on the embankments, still in the tunnels, still crossing the viaducts at dawn to check the stonework before his crews arrive. The financial crisis has bankrupted dozens of railway companies. Half-built lines scar the landscape of England like unfinished sentences. But the lines that were always commercially sound, the ones whose routes made genuine geographic sense, whose capital requirements were honestly calculated, whose business case did not depend on fraudulent projections, those lines continue. They are completed, often by companies restructured from the wreckage of the mania, often with government support, often with the kind of calm institutional determination that is only possible once the speculators have left the room. Stephenson builds the high-level bridge over the Tyne. He completes the Royal Border Bridge at Berwick. He solves engineering problems that the mania, in its noise and frenzy, never gave him quiet enough to address. The technology was never the problem. It never is. The problem is always the same thing. The problem is us.
George Hudson flees to France in year 1849 to escape his creditors. He is the same age, in that year of exile, as John Blunt was when the South Sea Company collapsed, and he is making the same journey, in spirit, if not in geography, from power to disgrace. The men who once competed to sit at his dinner table now cross the street to avoid him. The members of Parliament who accepted his hospitality discover, with remarkable consistency, that they were always privately concerned about his methods. The parliamentary inquiry into his conduct runs for 3 years and produces reports that confirm every accusation the auditors first raised. He is required to repay over £600,000 to various railway companies, a figure he can never hope to meet. He returns to England eventually, stripped of almost everything, surviving on a small pension raised by a handful of loyal former supporters who cannot quite bring themselves to abandon him completely. He dies in 1871, largely forgotten, deeply in debt, in lodgings in London that bear no resemblance to the mansion in Knightsbridge, where he once entertained a nation. Robert Stephenson is elected to Parliament, not for his financial acumen, but for the respect his profession commands, and continues to build the railways that the mania dreamed about but could not build on its own. He dies in 1859, mourned with a national grief usually reserved for statesmen. Charles Dickens publishes Dombey and Son in full in 1848. It is read by a nation that recognizes, in its pages, the thing they have just lived through. The railway as instrument of transformation. The railway as instrument of destruction. Both at once. Always both at once. And somewhere in smaller rooms than she once kept. Eleanor Marsh reads it too. And understands. In year 1850, Britain has 6,000 miles of working railway. Let that settle for a moment. The country that in 1830 moved at the speed of a horse now moves at the speed of a locomotive. Manchester to London in 4 hours. Edinburgh to London in 10. Goods that took weeks by canal take days by rail. Fresh fish from the coast reaches the inland cities before it spoils. The newspapers that once arrived in the north 2 days late arrive the same morning. The army can move across the country in a day. The post moves hourly. The world has been fundamentally remade. And this is the paradox at the heart of the Railway Mania, the thing that sets it apart from every bubble that came before. The tulips are gone. There is nothing to show for the Dutch mania of year 1637, except records of absurd prices and some very beautiful paintings of flowers that no longer exist. The South Sea Company produced nothing. Its shares were paper backed by promises, backed by more paper. When the bubble burst, there was no residue of value. Nothing was built. But the Railway Mania left 6,000 miles of iron. It left bridges that still carry trains today. It left tunnels cut through mountains that engineers said could not be tunneled. It left the infrastructure of a modern nation, the arteries through which a country's commerce flows. The bubble was a disaster. The railways were a miracle. Both of those things are true. And it is worth sitting with the discomfort of that truth, because it is the most complex thing this series has asked you to hold. The greed was real. The harm was real. The ruin was real. And so was the transformation. History is not always clean enough to give us villains we can undo. There is a school of thought that says the best way to understand a financial crisis is to read the economists who dissected it. And the economists are useful. But Dickens is truer. Dombey and Son is not a novel about railways. It is a novel about what happens to a man and a class, and an age when it mistakes the accumulation of capital for the purpose of life. Mr. Dombey is not a villain. He is a man who has organized his entire existence around the logic of the market, and who discovers, at enormous personal cost, that the market does not love him back. The railway in the novel does not appear as a symbol of progress. It appears as a force, cold, indifferent, unstoppable. It tears through a neighborhood near King's Cross. It levels the homes of people who cannot afford to move. It creates wealth for its shareholders and devastation for everyone in its path. It is, in other words, a perfect image of capital itself. Dickens was 33 years old when the mania peaked, and 36 when he finished the novel. He had watched everything. He had written everything down. And he had understood, with the particular clarity of the artist who refuses to look away, what the economists and the parliamentarians and the railway promoters had all, in their various ways, preferred not to see. That the people at the bottom of the prospectus, the names that appear nowhere in it, the people who supply the capital that funds the lines, that generate the returns that enrich the directors, are not investors. They are the fuel. The Regulation of Railways Act passes in 1868, 20 years after the crash. It introduces proper state oversight of railway companies. It establishes inspection requirements. It creates meaningful accountability for directors. It ensures that the kind of accounts manipulation George Hudson conducted for a decade cannot be hidden from shareholders. It is thorough. It is well designed. It is, by any measure, the regulatory framework that should have existed in year 1844. It comes 21 years too late for Eleanor Marsh. But this is always how it works. Every regulatory framework that protects ordinary investors from fraud was written in the aftermath of a fraud. Every law that prevents insider manipulation of markets was drafted because of insider manipulation that destroyed people's savings. Every protection that now seems obvious and permanent and inarguable was once considered unnecessary right up until the moment it became catastrophically, undeniably necessary. The pattern does not change. Only the dates change. And the assets. And the names of the men who run the fraud. We are going to do something now that this channel does every time. We are going to step back, far enough back to see all three at once. Amsterdam, year 1637, a flower. London, year 1720, a share. Britain, year 1845, a railway. Three different centuries, three different nations, or rather, the same nation at three different stages of its commercial development. Three completely different underlying assets. Three completely different technologies, or lack of technology. Three completely different sets of circumstances that, each time, produced a unique and unrepeatable historical event that was also exactly the same event. The pattern. Early adopters who are right about the underlying asset. A first wave of commercial success that proves the concept. A broadening of participation, more investors, more capital, more ordinary people who were not part of the first wave and who are joining rationally on the basis of real evidence. Then the promoters arrive, the fraudsters, the men who understand that an already rising market is the perfect cover for their operations, because in a rising market, even a fraudulent instrument produces returns, and returns silence questions. Then the regulators look away, not always from corruption, sometimes simply from the same optimism that has infected everyone else. The same rising prices, the same extraordinary returns. Then the peak, the moment when every indicator says buy, and the correct answer is sell. The moment when the market is most confident and most wrong simultaneously. Then the fracture, the correction, the realization, the crash. Then the inquiry, the report, the legislation, the amnesia. Then the next time. The Railway Mania has one lesson that the Tulip and the South Sea did not offer. And it is the most important lesson this series has yet delivered. Real technology does not protect you from irrational markets. Say it again. Real technology does not protect you from irrational markets. The railway was genuinely revolutionary. Robert Stephenson was genuinely brilliant. The lines that were well conceived and honestly promoted did genuinely transform Britain. None of that, not a single true word of it, protected Eleanor Marsh from the fraud in the prospectus she signed in good faith. None of it protected the thousands of investors who lost their savings to companies that existed only on paper. None of it made the Parliament that failed to scrutinize those companies any less negligent. And here is why that matters. Because the argument you will hear in every bubble, the argument that is always loudest at the peak, the argument that silences the doubters, the argument that makes the skeptic look like a fool, is this. This time is different. The technology is real. And sometimes the technology is real. The railway was real. The internet was real. The smartphone was real. But real technology, when it becomes the vehicle for financial mania, does not change the mechanics of the mania. The prices still rise beyond any rational relationship to underlying value. The insiders still profit before the ordinary investor. The regulators still arrive after the wreckage. The ordinary investor still pays. Every time. Not because the technology wasn't real, but because the mania was.
Britain in year 1850 stands on 6,000 miles of railway track and looks at what it has built and what it has destroyed in the same decade and decides, with the particular resilience of a nation that has always been better at rebuilding than at preventing, to move forward. The inquiries conclude. The legislation is drafted. The fraudsters are shamed, if not imprisoned. The engineers who were building through all of it finish their bridges, complete their tunnels, lay their final sleepers. The country that emerges from the Railway Mania is faster, more connected, and more commercially sophisticated than the one that entered it. It is also more scarred, more unequal, home to a generation of Eleanor Marshes, careful, trusting people who played by the rules of a game that was being rigged above their heads. We remember the Railway King. We do not remember her. That, perhaps, is the greatest injustice of all. But the pattern, the irresistible, repeating, human pattern did not die on the embankments of the year 1847. It did not stay in Britain. It crossed the Atlantic on a steam-powered ship, one of the other miracles the Industrial Revolution had produced. It found new land, new mountains, new rivers full of the oldest promise in the world. A new word for wealth. Gold. California, year 1848.
The first American mania. Tens of thousands of ordinary people from every country on earth, abandoning their lives, their families, their professions, their safety for a chance at something that glittered in a riverbed and promised everything. The gold rush. Same greed, different hills. Same ending. We'll see you there.